Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation, with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking with ForeFlight co-founders Tyson Weiss and Jason Miller for an update on new features. And later, we'll be talking with CFI Anise Shapiro about her engine failure in a Piper Malibu and how she would handle it differently in the future. Last week in episode 174, we talked with two pilots who flew a 5-day CAP mission to deliver vaccine. And we heard from mega supporter Seth Lake, who shared all the details pilots need to know about military training routes. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And I'd like to ask for your help to grow this show. Take a moment right now to find the share button on whatever app that you're using to listen to me and share Aviation News Talk with a friend who you think might benefit from the show. And then follow up with him or her and suggest they subscribe to the show. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, there's a new WingSpar AD for Piper aircraft. A drone saves the day in an unusual way, and we finally have a clue to those reports of a jetpack pilot flying near LAX. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, new Piper WingSpar AD affects 5,400 aircraft. Owners of Piper PA-28 and Piper PA-32 models have been hit with a series of airworthiness directives over the last year, including one related to main spar corrosion, but the latest AD stems from a fatal accident in 2018 when a Piper Arrow conducting flight training lost a wing and killed the FAA examiner and student. The Arrow was 11 years old but had accumulated more than 7,600 hours exclusively in the training environment. The most recent AD calls for inspections of the lower spar caps at the bolted joint to the carry-through structure inside the cabin for aircraft with more than 5,000 hours time in service and applies to more than 5,400 aircraft. The accident Arrow's wing failed due to a fatigue fracture at the bolted joint along the lower spar cap, according to investigators. The AD is effective on February 16, 2021, and affects PA-28 and PA-32 aircraft from the PA-28-151 Warrior up to the PA-32RT Saratoga. It also includes all Arrow models, but not the PA-28-236 Dakota or the lighter non-taper wing PA-28 series. Aircraft with more than 5,000 factored service hours must have the eddy current inspection performed within the next 100 hours. The test is said to cost a little more than $1,000 per aircraft, though a WingSpar replacement is estimated at more than $12,000 each wing. What's more, the FAA says it will not issue ferry permits to those aircraft found to have cracks. They will have to be repaired locally or disassembled and taken to an appropriate service facility. Finally, the FAA is calling this AD an interim measure, suggesting that data from the field could change the minimum number of service hours. From taskandpurpose.com, air traffic controller at Kirtland Air Force Base credited with saving lives of Osprey crew. A controller working in an air traffic control tower in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is being credited with saving the lives of 6 Air Force service members in a CV-22 Osprey that was nearly involved in a catastrophic failure. Wendy Smith was working in a tower serving both Kirtland Air Force Base and Albuquerque International Sunport on the evening of November 10, 2020, when she noticed something amiss with the Osprey, according to an Air Force press release, and reported over the radio, "Hey, Dusty 73, your right prop rotor looks weird." According to Lieutenant Colonel Brett Cassidy, the commander of the 71st Special Operations Squadron, the crew then looked out the window and saw the 3 tip lights on the prop rotor were not fully aligned as they should be. That was enough. They came back in, landed, and got a new aircraft and went back out, said Cassidy. The maintenance team downloaded the information, and that blade was vibrating 3 times its limit. It requires experience to know that something's wrong, Cassidy said of Smith, an FAA air traffic controller for more than a decade. She's probably one of the few people here with the experience to recognize that something's just not quite right. Further inspection found a bearing that controls the pitch of the blade was falling apart, which Cassidy estimated would have broken down completely after roughly an hour in the air. If the aircraft had continued not to report and the aircrew hadn't noticed the vibrations, it would have been a catastrophic failure, he said. That would have been a loss of the aircraft and crew. And I'd just like to add that anytime you're flying an aircraft and you see something that looks amiss with another aircraft, definitely speak up on the frequency and let it be known. I did see a posting sometime in the last year from a low-time private pilot who said that he had spotted something but didn't speak up because he wasn't sure of the proper protocol of how to report something that appeared amiss with another aircraft. And of course, there is no proper protocol. Just speak up and let somebody know what you see. From GeneralAviationNews.com, FAA launches new safety data tool. The FAA is making it easier to research aviation safety guidance material from the Office of Aviation Safety, or AVS, which is responsible for the certification, production approval, and continued airworthiness of aircraft, as well as the certification of pilots, mechanics, and others in safety-related positions. The Dynamic Regulatory System, or DRS, combines more than 65 document types from more than a dozen different repositories into a single searchable application. This comprehensive knowledge center centralizes the FAA's aviation safety guidance material from the Flight Standards Information System and the agency's regulatory guidance system. What does this mean for GA pilots? According to Pete Bunce, president and CEO of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, the much-anticipated DRS provides a centralized public database of regulatory safety guidance materials which will benefit the GA manufacturing, maintenance, and repair industries, as well as the FAA. Gamma and its member companies have been advocating for this critical tool, and we were pleased to be a resource throughout its development and have the opportunity to provide feedback during the testing phase. We have also appreciated the congressional support for this important initiative. The industry has been eager to use a tool that helps promote consistency in regulatory interpretation and application by making regulations, policy, and guidance readily available. From AOPA.org, now this article has essentially two titles that are related. The first one, Pilots Plan on Florida Super Bowl Restrictions, and Civil Air Patrol Celebrates 20 Years of Interceptions. Now, pilots can stay out of the Super Bowl limelight by adhering to FAA airspace protocols in place for the February 7th game at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida. Pilots should be on the lookout for special air traffic procedures centered on Tampa from February 3rd to 9th, well ahead of the 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff that could affect VFR and IFR arrivals and departures. Pilots should expect a 30 nautical mile radius TFR over the stadium, along with preferred IFR arrival and departure routes. A parking reservation program will be in place at all area airports, so pilots will need to contact their FBO of choice to make arrangements. The FAA recommends that pilots check NOTAMs frequently to verify they have the most current information. A total of 17 airports are affected by the airspace procedures. The area surrounding the Super Bowl is also a no-drone zone, and additional unmanned aircraft restrictions will be in place before, during, and after the game. Interceptions above the field will be handled by U.S. Air Force jet crews. The crews will practice capture procedures in advance with CAP volunteers flying Cessna 182s into simulated restricted airspace. During typical training exercises, 2 GA aircraft fly as intercept targets for Air National Guard fighter jets, while a third CAP aircraft known as a hybrid flies as a communication hub, coordinating radio traffic from participants on the ground and in the air, explained Civil Air Patrol Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Solomon. Closer to game time, the U.S. Air Force will dispatch fighter jets to patrol the TFRs. The CAP is marking its 20th year as a participant in the North American Aerospace Defense Command air defense exercises designed to protect the big game's airspace. From CleanTechnica.com, a drone saves the day in an unusual way. Recently in Australia, electric aviation saved the day again, but not in the usual way. A man used a drone to get a text message out, allowing rescuers to find a stranded group of people. Said Queensland Emergency Services Area Controller James Gegg, he was clever enough to think that if he typed the message on his phone and pressed send, that it would keep trying to send until it got reception. The stranded adventurers then attached the phone to a small drone and sent it up high. Because UHF radio waves almost always travel line of sight, they needed to get the phone up to where the signal wouldn't be blocked by terrain and vegetation. When he brought the drone back down, he confirmed the message had been sent, so he did get reception. That raised the alarm and people were able to activate, Craig said. Before getting stranded, the 4 adults and a 6-month-old baby were traveling on the rugged Kirrarama Range Road to see Blencoe Falls. They planned to go back by another way, but unusually heavy rains from a tropical cyclone remnant flooded the creeks in the area. They came across a creek that they couldn't cross safely and turned around only to find that another creek they had crossed was also flooded out. Their engine stalled out when attempting to cross, leaving them stranded in the wilderness with no cell phone signal. What makes this case so unusual is that the drone was used as a tool by the people needing rescue and not the rescuers. So far, over 500 people have been saved by rescue personnel using drones in the field. The 500th rescue, as counted by DJI, involved sheriff's deputies using thermal vision to locate a lost elderly woman. Most other rescues were similar, with rescuers using a drone to spot missing persons or using the drone to relay instructions by loudspeaker. This is the first case Clean Technica is aware of where stranded or missing people use the drone to get help. From flyer.co.uk, STEMI adds inboard range extender to their electric motor glider. Motor glider manufacturer STEMI has used the pandemic time to further develop its new Elfin-20 electric self-launching glider aircraft. Rainer STEMI, boss of the company, said, "We have used the opportunity of corona-induced delays to further develop and incorporate many design improvements. The overall performance and handling of the aircraft has been significantly enhanced." The Elfin-20.E has a similar design to STEMI's existing S10 and S12 motor gliders fitted with Rotax engines, but has been thoroughly re-engineered for an electric propulsion system. The Elfin-20.E battery capacity has been increased by 50%, with 3 10.5 kilowatt-hour battery packs instead of 2, meaning it can take off and fly for 2.5 hours on pure electric power. For gliding, the prop blades can be retracted into the spinner, as they are with the S10 and S12 for reduced drag. The second version of the Elfin-20.EX, has a range extender. The range extender is the avgas-burning AE50R rotary engine produced by Austro Engine, the Austrian company set up by Diamond Aircraft to produce engines for its aircraft. The AE50R works with an MRAX generator to charge the batteries while airborne. The system is mounted in the rear fuselage. 2 45-liter fuel tanks are in the wings. STEMI has also installed a BSR Aerospace rescue parachute system with the EASA and FAA approval. And finally, from thedrive.com, airliner pilot says jetpack guy over LAX looked just like this crazy drone. Months after an initial report from airline pilots about seeing what appeared to be an individual flying alongside them using a jetpack as they came in to land at LAX, that incident and subsequent encounters in Southern California remained as curious and unexplained as ever. Newly obtained documents from the FAA show officials were also stumped after the first sighting. At the same time, they were asking similar questions and considering one of the exact same possibilities that we here at the War Zone have also explored. John Greenwald, a vigorous filer of Freedom of Information Act requests and author who runs the website The Black Vault, received the documents through the FOIA process and generously shared them. Multiple aircraft reported man in jetpack maneuvering at 3,000 feet on 10-mile final to runway 25 right, reads a brief initial notice regarding the incident that the FAA sent out. As was noted at the time, air traffic controllers did not spot anything on radar that would match the description of what became known as the jetpack guy. However, the documents do include a very interesting series of emails. One email to a group of officials said they had contacted David Mayman, the chief test pilot at Jetpack Aviation based in Weihs, California, who was skeptical of the reported sighting. He confirmed that they have not flown for months, Goodall wrote of his conversation with Mayman. He stated that he does not believe there are any jetpack operators who could get to 3,000 feet and sustain it. The FBI has been leading the investigation into the incident since shortly after the initial report. Mike Bumberger of LEAP, that's Law Enforcement Assistance Program, shared that the FBI interviewed the American Airlines pilot that made the jetpack sighting. Blanco wrote, "The pilot said what he saw was exactly like the drone in the YouTube video, which is referenced in this article. It is possible that this is some sort of a drone dressed up to look like a guy in a jetpack as seen in the video. Then the question becomes, why would somebody be doing this?" And yes, there is a picture here from the YouTube video that shows what looks like a person hanging from a drone, and it might look like someone in a jetpack. While a drone dressed up to look like a jetpack guy remains one theory, we still have no conclusive idea as to what or who the elusive LA Rocketeer actually is. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, an interview with ForeFlight co-founders talking about the latest new features in ForeFlight. And later, we'll talk with a CFI, Anise Shapiro, about her engine out in a Piper Malibu. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And next up is an interview with Tyson Weiss, who's one of our mega supporters, and Jason Miller. Together, they co-founded ForeFlight over 10 years ago And almost 2 years ago, they sold the company to Boeing. ForeFlight is, of course, a very popular electronic flight bag app that runs on iPhones and iPads. During the interview, Jason did a lot of screen sharing to show off the features he's talking about. Now, he does a good job of describing what he's showing, but if you want to see a video version of the interview, including the screen sharing and one of the outtakes, you can find it on our Patreon site as part of our video bonus content, which is available to supporters at the $20 a month and higher levels. To sign up, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now here's our conversation with Tyson Weiss and Jason Miller. Well, Tyson and Jason, welcome to the show. Great to have you both here.
Thanks, Max. It's good to see you and be back.
Well, it's always good to see each other in these crazy times. Let me go to you, Tyson, first. Tell us a little bit kind of from a high-level view, some of the interesting features that you've been working on, may have released recently at ForeFlight.
Yeah, so the last 2 years really have been super busy. The team is on this monthly release cadence, and we've got something new and exciting coming out. We've got some big themes that are guiding some of our development. Weather is one of those, and we've done a lot over the past couple of years to really improve weather. There's more of that on the way. Things like a new 10-day weather feature. We added cloud tops. Finally, we wanted to do that for a long time so that people could see new cloud levels. Because if you're a VFR pilot, that's one of the things that gives you anxiety. We enhanced our profile view. We added a lot of weather capability into that new profile view so that if you plan a flight, it'll actually show you different weather conditions along your route of flight. So weather has been a big focus of ours. We spent a lot of time developing our 3D platform as well. That lets you do 3D previews of your flight before and afterwards. It's a really great way to explore a new area. Jason and I have been doing a lot of mountain flying. And so if you're flying into an area that's got high terrain, really helps you visualize, what approaches are like going into those areas. And the map is obviously something our customers use on every flight. So we've done a lot of investments in the map, making the base map more detailed, improving water bodies, improving labels on things like peaks and mountain passes and rivers and things like that. And we've improved our street map system as well. So those are some of the big themes. And the last one I would mention is really investing a lot in our flights tab and our flight planning. That aspect of the application has become really, really powerful. The briefing has been really improved. The navlogs have improved. And for piston pilots, we've done a lot of work on computing takeoff and landing distances and speeds and those sorts of things. And so our hope is that pilots can use that advanced capability to better prepare for flights, because that's not something that a lot of us pilots did on every flight, right? And this makes it really easy. So those are some of the big themes that big areas we've been investing in over the past couple of years.
It sounds like you've been incredibly busy. I think when I first started using ForeFlight, I thought, wow, this thing has everything I will ever possibly need. And yet I am amazed that there are always more things to add. Jason, where do you guys come up with all the ideas, and how do you keep coming up with something new every month?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it comes from a lot of different places, right? I mean, our customers, first and foremost, are feeding us stuff. So that's super, super valuable to our planning process when we're coming up with new features. But, we're also using the product ourselves. So about half of the company, we're about 200 strong now, and about half of those folks are pilots, many instrument rated. So, they're traveling and using this on a near daily basis. So they're coming up with ideas, including Tyson and myself directly. And then, another interesting place where ideas come from, which early in my career I wouldn't have really realized, was we just look at what the app does today and we realize, oh, hey, if we added this little piece on top of what we've already got, we got this new cool thing. And so a lot of times it just comes on building from the foundation and just seeing what comes next. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, having worked with engineering design teams in the past, I think the cool factor is what drives a lot of new design and development. Got to be the reason
that gets you excited.
It really does.
Well, great.
Yeah, and the emergence of new technologies, right? I mean, every time Apple comes up with a new platform, something else we can use, people throughout the company are inspired to adopt that technology and do interesting things with it. So it's great to leverage some of those innovations too.
Well, it's certainly exciting times with a lot of new things going on in all kinds of areas of aviation. Jason, let's drill down and talk about some of the more recent features. And for those that are watching us in video, we can actually show them some of them as well.
Yeah, why don't we start with some of the weather stuff that Tyson mentioned. So we want to bring up the screen. I'm just sharing the latest version of ForeFlight on the iPad here. And what we're looking at here is just a simple trip from Austin to Page. And, he talked about some of the work we've done on the profile view. So that's sort of seeing your flight from the side. Originally, that was focused really on terrain and obstacles for us. But over the last few months, we've added multiple weather products into this. And at least for me, this has quickly become a place that I do a good chunk of my pre-flight planning in terms of looking for icing, looking for turbulence, of course, looking for terrain and concerns like that. Airspace, less of a concern for me personally, just because I'm typically IFR, but it's great to see in here. And also clouds, because with my particular airplane, I'm flying the TBM, and a lot of times I'm having to manage the engine if we're in flying through the clouds, even when there's not icing. So I'm also often looking for a cruise level that will keep me out of the soup. So here we're seeing the side view of this flight, and not only are we seeing these different weather layers, but we're seeing how they change throughout my flight here. So you can see sort of towards the bottom of this, right under the graphics here, we're looking at the different waypoints and my time to cross those. And so the weather that we see is time smeared. It's like a 4-dimensional estimation using these data products for what the weather will actually look like when I, for example, get to my destination out here. So I can see mostly I'm right over this blue icing, but during my descent, I might, right before I get to Page, see a little touch of light ride there. So the blue here is the icing, and the gray is the different cloud levels being shown. And the darkness of it just kind of represents how likely there are to be clouds there. So it's a probability factor. But this has been a great new feature. I think people will be using this more and more as we continue to improve it. And I will say I can preview like one change that's coming with this, and it's definitely driven by my personal flying, but also customer requests, is that we're going to bring this down to not just the iPad, but the iPhone. This is one of the few things that we don't have on the iPhone today. It's so valuable that we need to fix that.
Yeah, the profile view is really stunning. I think this is the first time I recall seeing that someone could look at the ice 3-dimensionally across the trip. So we could see essentially, the bottom of the ice, the top of the ice, and how far it extends throughout the entire trip. That's incredibly valuable, and I don't think I've seen a 3-dimensional view like that before.
I was going to say there's one other place in the application that customers can find a view like that, and that's in the briefing. If you change your briefing to the PDF view, you can see a cross-section chart, which is similar. That's one you can print and it's static, but it also has an icing representation there. So those two views, we call them sort of like briefing and an image, right? In one image or in one profile view, you can get a lot of the information you need about en route weather conditions, which is great.
And it looked like it was not just the weather as well. It looked like we had some restricted airspace and various other things shown there as well. So it really is a pretty comprehensive view of what you're going to encounter throughout the entire route.
Right. So I can dive into the next weather feature if that works for you.
Go right ahead.
Or we can bring up the screen again. This was one that was near and dear to my heart because I got to work on it personally. We wanted to be able to show some of the weather forecasts further out in time, and we, about a year or two ago, added the Mos Forecast, which is, you could think of kind of like an automated TAF. In fact, it tends to be one of the inputs that the TAF creators use when they're coming up with their own forecast. But this one goes out a little further than the TAF, but we were looking to see, okay, well, how much further out into the future can we go? And so we found a good source of weather that's on an hourly basis. We tend to refer to it as the daily weather, but it'll go out 10 days. And we put this in as a recent feature, I think maybe in December. And so here it's sort of like what you would get from a consumer weather app. We have the standard, temperature, highs and lows, precipitation probabilities, that sort of stuff. But if you tap into one of these, you get more of an aviation bent to this data. So something that was important to us was to take that kind of consumer data feel and make sure we focus on things like what the flight category is expected to be, what the ceiling is, and give you a more utility in terms of aviation use for this type of data. But as I scroll here in the middle, I'm just seeing every little hourly block, in this case for Oshkosh. I can tap any of these. It'll give me a little more detail up in the upper section there, that white area. And I can also scroll the bottom to go out a day at a time. And if you notice at the bottom of that lower area, there's a colored bar. And what that's showing is throughout the 24-hour period of each of these days, what is the flight category expected to be? So if you're, for example, wanting to take off or land VFR, you could make sure, look down here and say, okay, Tuesday looks like probably the morning to afternoon's good, but around midnight it's going to be IFR. So I'd want to avoid that. So that's one of our more recent weather features.
Well, and what I really like about that is it will save me the trouble of having to go back and forth between ForeFlight and consumer programs, because I would say Wonderground has been kind of my go-to for, what's the resolution look like when you want to get more fine than what you typically find from the FAA.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. The other benefit of this data source is that it's global. So, and it's really high res. In fact, too, it's down to probably every 100 meters or so, the forecast is slightly adjusted. So any point on the globe in the app, you can call up this weather, including wherever you're standing right now, in case you just want your local forecast. So it's been well received, and I've made good use of it myself too. So we like that one.
Yeah, I find once you use it sort of 3 or 4 times, you go, oh gosh, all right, I know where to go to get my daily weather as well. And we've got some enhancements coming out to this feature in the next release as well. And it has become our daily driver for recreational weather. And since we have that hour by hour forecast, there are other places in the app we can bring that into, like helping you if you're doing a runway performance calculation, informing you about the conditions live there, which is another enhancement to that capability.
All right, Jason. So tell us what you have up there next.
Yeah, I thought we would dive into some of the 3D capabilities that Tyson mentioned earlier. So here on the screen, we're seeing the Salt Lake City details for the airport. We're looking at the DATIS and, the daily weather, all the stuff we were just talking about is in here as well. But if I go to this 3D view button towards the upper top of the screen here, we get into the 3D view that we've had for about maybe a year or so. But one of the recent things that we added here is the ability to see internet traffic coming in real time. I mean, this stuff's delayed by only a few seconds and in 3 dimensions. So obviously we have the Salt Lake City airport environment here in front and center, and we're looking out to the south. We can see the traffic that's inbound, outbound, anything in this area. We can kick the view around here. I'm just using my finger to pan around, look out over the lake there, see a SkyWest heading out and the American Airlines on the runway. So this has been very useful for pre-flight purposes if you're trying to just get the lay of the land in terms of what the traffic's doing right now, maybe what procedures they're doing, what direction they're landing, or what individual runways they're using, which is especially good when there's not a DATIS available. Or you just want to not only take in the 3D environment, but just how people are coming in and out. So this has been a really, really cool feature. This is part of our performance package that we added recently.
That is really spectacular. I mean, I love the 3D view, but we were just looking there from 10,000 feet. And at the end there, you were looking north. So we had the Wasatch Mountains off to our right. And we could see American Airlines Flight 157. It was climbing through about 4,500 feet, taking off from either the left runway, or I couldn't quite tell exactly. But that's spectacular. I mean, that's now I'm sitting here thinking all we need is internet in the airplane, and we could have live traffic and 3D. And then at some point you go,
grail.
And then at some point you go, hey, we don't even need to fly. We can just sit at home and pretend we're doing all this stuff.
A point about that traffic feature is if you don't see the traffic at your particular airport, we partnered with FlightAware on this data. Well, you can build or buy or have FlightAware send you a receiver that you can install at your airport. So if there's a small rural airport and you want to see the pattern traffic in the pattern, you can just put one of these antennas up and it'll feed right into ForeFlight.
Wow, that's amazing. I was going to say the world is so much fun these days when you get to just create new things like this and be able to see more and more. I think it helps make the pilots safer as well and helps with planning. Well, any other goodies there?
Well, I thought lastly I might touch on the flights view that Tyson also mentioned. And this is something that we've had in one form or another since really day one, but it's evolved so much and so incrementally over the years that it's completely different than it was, well, even a couple of years ago. So here we're just looking at an example of a flight I did yesterday. And one of the big capabilities we added maybe 2 years ago as part of our introduction to the performance package was very detailed and accurate numbers for your en route performance. And so that's what we're seeing at the top of the screen here. This was a short flight. I was just doing a hop over to the maintenance shop. But it's telling me down to the minute and down to the 10th of a gallon exactly what my performance is going to be. It's making use of not only the winds aloft as I climb out and descend, but also the temperature variations and how my aircraft performs, throughout those different variables. So I forget how many dimensions that it's working in, probably 4 or 5, but it's doing some really complicated calculations to come up with a really accurate number. So that's been a huge enhancement, especially important for people that are flying, up in the flight levels or even into the lower teens. It's a meaningful difference in the accuracy of the performance calculation. But the other thing that we've added even more recently is the runway performance aspects here. So you can see kind of in the middle here, we've got the departure of EDC and the destination of San Antonio there. We've got an info button that you can tap just to view the normal airport view and get details there. But if I hit the takeoff button, for example, from EDC, I can choose a runway. And let's just say we're going to use runway 13 because it's got a slightly better headwind. And I get the detailed information about my takeoff performance for this aircraft. This is a TBM. So I'll use just under 2,000 feet. My rotate speed will be 86 and so forth. It's loaded in the latest METAR. It will load in the latest TAF, MOS, or even use that daily weather if the time of departure is too far out in the future to use a METAR. But it will take all that into account to calculate the numbers. And this is, of course, based on the POH, the book values. One thing I do want to point out here, beyond just the basics, is this safety distance factor. So right now it's set to 1.0. If instead I say, okay, I want to add sort of a fudge factor of roughly 40% here. So I'll say I want my safety distance to be 1.4. It goes ahead and takes that into account, and you see my total distance went up by 40% roughly. So it's a good way for you to, realize, hey, my, pilot technique isn't going to perfectly match the test pilot that originally made these numbers. I might not start right at the edge of the runway threshold, all the little variables there. I can give myself a little fudge factor and have that taken into account. And it'll warn me if then, there's not enough runway to account for that. So that's a pretty cool one.
Well, Max, one of the other things that's nice about this feature, I use it in the DA40, and I brought the DA40 up into the mountains this summer and did some mountain flying. And for the DA40, it will tell me my climb rate, right? And so that's really important when you're having a temperature variance from, say, the 70s to maybe the 80s or 90s. Big impact in that airplane, which isn't turbocharged, on the climb rate. And so it really helped me spot some opportunities where I said, man, if I leave a little bit later in the day, my climb rate isn't going to get me high enough, fast enough, right? So it's a great tool when you're in an area, especially mountainous area, where your climb rates may change. If you're in an airplane that maybe not be turbocharged, what the impact of that will be on your takeoff performance.
That's interesting. So I hadn't realized that. So essentially what you're saying is you can look at the performance by hour, essentially, and kind of pick the hour when you want to get the best performance.
Exactly. Yeah, when we had 85-degree temperatures in the mountains one day, and I had a 250 foot per minute climb rate in the airplane, and so that's a no-go. And you realize, I've got to fly this early in the morning in order to get up high enough. So this can really help pilots out with quickly analyzing performance information.
Wow, that's fantastic. And Jason, you were referring to this as a fudge factor. I always think of this as safety margin. And as pilots, I'm always encouraging people to build in extra margin everywhere they go. Mm-hmm. I mean, one example would be if you're flying next to the class Bravo, well, don't go right up to the point where your wing is right next to that little line. Put an extra mile in there or something like that, so that if the radar at the FAA is slightly different than what you see on your map, nobody even calls it into question. So yeah, I think we want to build margin into every aspect of our flying, and this is a good example where you don't want to just have a runway that's exactly the length that you think the takeoff performance is.
Exactly.
You want to build in
for sure
extra margin everywhere. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all these great features. Can we have you back again someday?
Anytime.
That'd be
great. It's been fun talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, my thanks to Jason and Tyson for coming on the show. I know they're both very busy guys. If you want to find out more about ForeFlight, just go out to ForeFlight.com, or in the iOS App Store, just look for ForeFlight. Coming up next, my updates, and then we'll get to our conversation with Anise Shapiro about her engine out in a Piper Malibu. all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And I just wanted to add a quick follow-up to the ForeFlight interview. I went out and checked out a couple of features, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I found. First, on the profile view, you can get to that from the Maps tab and then click Profile near the upper right. That brings up the profile window. Initially, I didn't see weather in my profile window, but then after looking, I found a layers icon in the lower left of the profile window. Now, this looks just like the layers icon in the upper left that you would use for adding layers to the main map, but this is dedicated specifically for the profile view. So take a look for that. And when I touched it, it then brought up choices to display airspace, icing, turbulence, and clouds. So great feature, and I will definitely use that in the future. Now, Jason also talked about the new Takeoff button, which you'll find in the Flights tab, just to the left of the Info button next to the 2 airports in your flight plan. I pulled up an old flight for an SF-50 Vision jet, and I didn't see the Takeoff button, so I contacted ForeFlight support, and they got right back to me. They said takeoff and landing data is not currently available for the Cirrus SF-50 Vision jet. You can view which aircraft have takeoff and landing data available in the link below. They will have a green check mark next to the profile if it is available. And I went out to the link, and I saw they have just a huge number of aircraft with performance data. So most likely you will see the takeoff button for whatever aircraft you happen to be flying. And I'll include a link in the show notes so that you can see if your aircraft is on the list. And of course, you can always find the show notes either in the app that you're listening to us on right now, or by going out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/175. And now here's another fun flying destination.
Hi, Max. This is Paras Trivedi from the Bay Area. I'd like to share with your listeners a very unique experience flying around the big island of Hawaii. Few years ago, I was there on family vacation, and I contacted a local air tour company at Hilo Airport. I was able to fly a GA-8 Airvan 6-seater aircraft with an instructor around the island, including over the volcanic activity area and many spectacular waterfalls. It was a great privilege to log time on a Hawaiian airport in a new aircraft type for me and accomplish sightseeing at the same time. I highly recommend to your listeners to take advantage of being a GA pilot while on vacation and take instructional flights at all islands of Hawaii or any tourist area they visit on vacation. I hear Maui has an FBO that offers flights on a Cirrus. I would love to try that when I go there next time. And I highly recommend taking a local instructor with you on each flight. It's just safer, especially when you are on vacation and not in your home turf. Thanks again for a great podcast. Thanks a lot.
And Paris, thanks so much for sending that and sharing us with our listeners. And yes, I've done the same thing on vacation, and I have found that often it's not worth the time to get fully checked out in the aircraft with an instructor to then go fly on my own, because I just want to do a short flight for an hour, so I take the instructor with me the entire time, and that works out just great. So if you have a favorite place that you love to fly and you want to share it with everyone here, please go ahead and record about 90 seconds and send it to me. You can just use the Voice Memos app on your smartphone and then email that file to aviationnewstalk@gmail.com, or go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top, and that will take you to our SpeakPipe app where you can then record up to 90 seconds, and that file will get emailed to me automatically, whether it's a listener question or a fun flying destination. And I just want to take a couple moments to call your attention to a new feature that I read about on generalaviationnews.com. They call it It Could Happen to Anybody. They say in this new feature, we take a deep dive into an NTSB accident report, giving you the full narrative from the NTSB docket with analysis of the accident and lessons that can be learned from Captain Brian Schiff. And the accident that they talk about here is rather tragic. It is a Cessna 182 in which a pilot was struck by a propeller during the pre-flight inspection. Now, we talked a lot about deadly propeller accidents back in episode 125. And if you haven't heard that episode, I strongly encourage you to go check it out. Well, I mentioned then I think that propeller accidents are vastly underreported, as I could find numerous instances that were reported in the press, but not reported in the NTSB database. In this particular case, a husband and wife had been out flying. The husband had shut down the aircraft, and he went out to the propeller, apparently moved the propeller. The engine started, and he was instantly killed by the propeller. Now, the investigation revealed that from the pilot's perspective, the ignition switch appeared to be in the off position. They said that investigators also noted that the ignition key was easily removable from the ignition switch in the left and right positions. Subsequent testing of the ignition was performed by a mechanic. The ignition switch was marked where it was found after the accident, which was somewhat between the off and the right positions. And in that position, the right magneto was hot or not grounded, and the key could be fully removed from the ignition switch that was tightly secured to the instrument panel. They say when in the off position, the switch did not align with the instrument panel placard marking. They said the pilot had purchased the aircraft in 2007. His wife said there was no previous instance in which the key could be removed from the ignition switch in an intermediate position or any position other than the off position. The article goes on to say that if possible, you should avoid moving the propeller under any circumstances, as just in this case, sometimes there can be a hot mag and the propeller can start for just a couple seconds, which is just long enough to kill you. Down in the comments section, Bob says, this has actually happened to me. The key was on top of the dash and the engine started. Working for a small school, the aircraft were parked outside. In cold weather, it was my object to sit the student at the controls and pull the blades through to limber the oil and prime the cylinders. The key was visible on top of the dash. I pulled the first blade through, no problem. Pulled the second blade through, I felt a small kickback. Didn't think too much about it. Key was visible. Told the student to keep his feet on the brakes. Pulled the third blade through, and the engine roared to life. The key was on the dash. Quite shaken, I found the original pilot had not turned the key right off, just pulled it out after pulling the mixture to idle cutoff. The magnetos were left hot. A worn rotary ignition switch was the problem. Could have been quite disastrous for me. I now give propellers a great deal of respect and consider them hot at all times. And another gentleman who commented, Steve, said, I'd never heard this before. I thought this was a good insight. One of the biggest contributors to worn keys is the habit of putting heavy objects on the key ring. I tell any customer of mine to not do that. The extra weight in combination with the aircraft vibrations causes extra wear on the key tumblers. If you need to ID your key, only add a single lightweight tag. And by the way, this aircraft was a 1976 Cessna 182. So the ignition switch might have been over 40 years old. So you can just imagine how much wear and tear would happen in that time. And I'll go ahead and add a link to this article in the show notes, but you might want to check this out in the future at generalaviationnews.com, the new feature called It Could Happen to Anybody. And here's a message from a new Patreon supporter, Wilkins Vicioso. He says, Max, I'd like to thank you for being a part of my training journey. I live in Connecticut, but drove down to Farmingdale Airport in Long Island 4 hours each day to complete my instrument training. You were with me on every drive. 2 days ago, I took my instrument rating check ride, and on the ride there, I listened to episode 33, Overcoming Check Ride Anxiety. And I have to say, thank you for calming my nerves. I will continue to listen and support you and your work. Please accept my sincere thanks, and know I'm always here to keep the blues side up. Well, thanks, Wilkins, and I'll just recommend that episode for anyone else who has a check ride coming up. Episode 33, Overcoming Check Ride Anxiety. And I want to briefly mention that I have made some changes to the goodies that you get when you sign up to support the show each month via Patreon. Patreon supporters at the $8 a month level, in addition to getting the show scripts and links to all the news stories that we had to cut for time, will also now get early access to some of the shows that I finish early and post earlier for Patreon supporters. Previously, only supporters at the $20 a month and higher level had early access to podcast episodes. Now people at the $8 a month level will also get early access. And I've decided to start producing a lot more video bonus content for people who support the show at the $20 a month and higher level. In some cases, I'll upload the video version of interviews that are audio only in the podcast, such as the ForeFlight interview, and these will sometimes include behind-the-scenes outtakes. Also in the future, in some cases, just a portion of an interview will make it into the podcast, but I'll provide a longer form of the interview covering more topics with the same guest in the bonus video version. So, for example, in a moment, you'll hear my interview with Anise Shapiro talking about her engine out, but the full video version of that interview runs for 28 minutes. It includes photos of Anise and the accident aircraft in the bonus video version. And that video should be available for Patreon supporters at the $20 a month and up level later this week. So if you've ever thought in the past, hey, I'd like to support the show, now is a great time to do it, as you'll get even more goodies. And signing up is easy. Just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and that will take you to our Patreon site where you can enter your credit card and select how much money you'd like to pledge each month to support the show. Or you can make a one-time donation or a monthly contribution via credit card at PayPal by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And here are the names of the 6 people who this week felt they were getting value from the show and who took the time to sign up. And they are Nate Wynn, Greg Wood, Scott DeRine, Eric Greenfield, Chris Fenelon, and Trevor Moody, who added his pledge up to $20 a month. Thank you all so much for supporting Aviation News Talk. Now in a moment, my interview with Anise Shapiro, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. First, I want to congratulate the 3 controllers who helped Anise Shapiro during her engine out emergency. They have all received the Archie League Medal of Safety Award, and those controllers are Brian Cox, Larry Bell, and Colin McKinnon, and they work in the FAA's Fort Worth Center. You can hear an interview with the 3 controllers in episode 27 of the NATCA podcast, and I'll include a link to that podcast in the show notes. Anise Shapiro, who was the CFI on board the aircraft, started flying in 1997 in Addison, Texas, and since then she's accrued over 10,000 hours in all kinds of aircraft. She's a Cirrus CSIP instructor, and she also does some corporate work in various aircraft. Here's what the beginning of her emergency sounded like.
And Center, this is Malibu 550 Juliet Kilo. We're declaring emergency. We've lost our engine.
Malibu 550 Juliet Kilo. Roger, let me get an airport for you.
Thank you.
550 Juliet Kilo. I'm showing at your 1 o'clock and about 22 miles is Harrison Field. It's got 3,200 feet hard surface. That might be your closest option right now.
I got the airport in sight. We'll go on that. Thank you. Can you give me the identifiers?
It's should be Foxtrot 75.
And now here's our conversation with Anise Shapiro. Well, Anise, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Let's talk about the incident. What was the mission that you were doing that particular day, and what kind of aircraft were you flying in?
I'm very fortunate that one of my clients owns a Piper Malibu, and he is extremely passionate about helping, especially puppies. They also help cats, but we mostly just do puppies and dogs. So we volunteer for Pilot for Paws, and on that day we were flying the Piper Malibu out to Hereford, Texas, to pick up 2 females. One was pregnant, and one was the mom of her babies. There were 4 of them with us on board. And we picked them up in Hereford, and we were bringing them to Graham, Texas, so that they could get picked up by another pilot and make their way north. Most of them are going to Wisconsin, Michigan, Colorado, pretty far north. They have long journeys. So Yoni, my client's airplane, is called a Starship Enterprise. It's got a lot of room, so we normally pack it in with as many dogs as we can, and then we bring them back towards the Metroplex, and then several pilots will meet us and take them on to their destination.
And what were the airports you were flying to and from, and what was the altitude you were at when you ultimately had your incident?
So we left Mesquite Airport and had landed in Hereford to get the dogs, and we had loaded them up, and then we were on our way back to Graham, Texas, and we had climbed up to 15.5.
And so what was the first sign that you were having any kind of problem, and at what point in the trip did that occur?
Well, on the way to Hereford, I knew something was off, and you've probably experienced this before too. You know, we try to tell our clients to keep their feet on the pedals because you can feel the engine. So something was just off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know if it was fuel flow or a gut feeling, but I thought it was fuel flow actually, but there's no indication on any of the instruments. So I remember telling him, you really need to take this in to take it and get it looked at because something is wrong. And just constantly watching the engine instrument. So we made our way there. There were no issues at all. But I told him, let's do a thorough check. We'll do a thorough pre-flight, opening up the engine, couldn't see anything. Then we did a good run-up. Took a lot of time making sure that we ran up the airplane at several power settings just to make sure everything was all right. Told him to do a short field takeoff, make sure we run up the engine, make sure everything is good. And it seemed great. So we rolled, and about, everything's a little mushy in your head, but maybe 100, 200 feet in the air, we hear a loud bang. And it was very disconcerting, almost like a backfire, but there was also a little bit of like grinding noise to it, but there was no indication on the instrument. So he looked at me. I said, keep climbing. You want altitude? So we kept climbing, and then maybe another 100 feet or so, it did it again. Keep climbing. So I'm like, just climb over the airport. So we circled and we climbed over the airport so that I could watch the instruments, and we made it all the way to 15.5, and we continued to circle. Like, it sounds clear, and there's nothing I can see visually on the instruments. And so we could stay in Hereford where there's no mechanic or anything, or we can make our way back towards Metroplex. I was like, well, at least Abilene, I know there's a mechanic there that I'm friends with. I've worked with him before. And so I made my way that direction. And unfortunately, before we got close enough to that area, we were about 20, I think we were maybe 40, 50 miles north of Abilene, but 22 miles north from the closest airport, the engine quit. And so we had a windmilling prop.
Interesting. So did it have any warning other than the bangs that you'd had earlier?
No, I was watching he has a really good JPI on board, and I was watching all the temperatures look good. There was nothing. And even that little bit of uneasiness in my pedals, I didn't feel it. I didn't feel like something was really that wrong. So I did not know it was coming. I thought there was something off and it could get looked at by a mechanic later.
Right. And so when the engine quit, what was going through your mind at that time, and what were the first things that you started to do?
I started to direct him to what he needed to do. So you move into instructor mode very easily. And so I told him best glide, number one. I pushed nearest to try to find the nearest airport. And then I told him he's flying. I declared an emergency. They gave me the closest airport. I put it into the GPS, got us a course line, pulled up the iPad so I could have glide ring. Then I went to go pull out the checklist, make sure you run through to see if we could attempt a restart. Unfortunately, it would not restart. And so we shut it down then so we could increase the glide ratio and try to make Knox City.
And you mentioned something about the glide ring on the iPad. Explain to people what app you were using and exactly what that was.
Sure. It's on ForeFlight. ForeFlight is an app that pilots, a lot of us use for all of our navigation. So it has maps and weather, and that's something they've actually added. I'm not sure how long ago, but it is pretty great. And so you can actually put the glide ratio for that specific aircraft into the database. It has all kinds of information specifically on the airplane you're flying. And so then it will calculate based on what your ground speed is and what the headwind is, how far you can make it from the altitude you're at.
And I'm not familiar with the Malibu because I haven't done much work in it. Tell us about the glide ratio. How far could you expect to glide if you're at 15,000 feet?
It glides pretty well. I'd have to pull out the POH. I'm mostly in the Cirrus, so I don't even actually know the answer to that question, but I can find it for you.
Great. In fact, you know what? Let's tell everybody right now, where in the POH would you go to find that?
In your emergency procedures. Section
3, exactly.
Yeah, Section 3.
most of the POHs I've seen, it's right there on the first page of Section 3. So yeah, that's burned into my brain, so it's easy to go find it. So you had an airport in mind that you were gliding toward, and it sounds like for quite a while you thought you were going to be able to make it. What happened?
Yeah, ATC was great. As soon as I declared the emergency, they gave me the identifier and I put it in the GPS, and so we had a perfect course there, so we could fly the magenta line as we try to make it as far as we can. And as we were getting closer and closer to the ground, West Texas has really strong winds, and so unfortunately, as we just started to descend, the headwind became stronger and stronger, and so we couldn't make the runway. I didn't know 100% I could make the runway. And that's what I tell everybody. If you're not confirmed you can make the runway, you need to go with a plan B.
Well, and so it sounds like you had a plan B and maybe a plan C in your mind all along. Tell us about that thought process and, what your plan B and C were as you were descending.
So as an instructor, the number one thing that we teach them is I use ABCDE, so airspeed, best glide, best field. So you try to find where you can go. So runways are your number one choice, but there aren't any other runways there. So the next choice is going to be a road. Unfortunately, it's West Texas, so you don't have nice, wide, unobstructed roads, but you definitely want to look for that next. And then after that, you're going to try to find a field. Fortunately, West Texas is filled with lots and lots of wheat fields. So we were able to find a beautiful wheat field that had just been plowed and cleared of hay. And so that was what I felt was the most perfect place to land.
And we're not going to make the field. We're turning towards the highway.
Over 5,000 Julie Kilo, Roger. Do you feel you can make the highway?
Clear by.
Okay. We're letting people know you're going for the highway.
Three that are close to us, the winds were just too strong.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The winds were just too strong. We're going to have to pick one of these fields that's below us.
Roger, okay, I understand.
And I know that ATC had offered, they pointed out that Highway 114 was somewhere in the area. Did you see that? And was that something you were actively considering before you went for the field?
Definitely. So that's when we were going towards the airport, we were southbound, and then we turned towards the north for the highway. And when I looked at it, it didn't look like a highway to me. So I could see it. It was not a good option. It looked like a 2-lane road. There were fence lines on both sides. I liked the fact that there was a nice open field that had been plowed.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever done it before, knew what it would be like to land on it, but I liked the openness of everything. I didn't want to hit anything. When I talk to my students about choosing an emergency landing spot, I always compare it to back in the 80s when they had those commercials of the dummies that would hit a wall. If you remember, it was all about seatbelts, right? So it'd be like, this is what happens to your car at 60 miles an hour, and this is what happens to your car at 40 miles per hour. And most airplanes are not going to land less than 60 miles per hour. They're not even landing that slow. But even if they could, the dummy never survived. There's a lot of impact. So I didn't want to hit anything.
Well, and it sounds like you picked what appeared to be the best option with a reasonably good outcome. If you'd chosen the road and it was narrow, then that could have been a much worse outcome.
Correct.
Yeah, I remember years ago bringing an airplane back from Kansas with a client, and everything was very flat, fields everywhere surrounding us. And I said, hey, if the engine quit now, where would you go? And he goes, I would pick that little tiny road down there. And I looked, and of course it had power lines next to it. I think every road in the country has power lines next to it.
Yes.
So I think people think roads are the best option, but they aren't always are.
Yeah, that's one of the things I tell my students too when they're driving around. I was like, the road that you thought was going to be the best option, because we do lots of emergency practice, go drive near it. Tell me what you think from the ground, because you never know until you get too close to it that you have to have a plan B, and sometimes you don't have a choice. So.
Yeah, I read recently about a flight instructor who drove his truck across a field where an aircraft had landed just to see what it was like. And he said he stopped at 29 miles an hour because his head was banging against the headboard.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard the ATC audio and you sounded remarkably calm. How were you able to stay so calm during your first engine failure?
It's actually kind of crazy to me, because when I heard my voice on there as well, I could not believe how calm I sounded. Yeah. I don't believe I was as calm as I came off. I think I went into pilot mode. This is just what you do. And I think especially because I had a client on board, the calmer I stay, the calmer they are. So you go into instructor mode. He was getting a little nervous. I was nervous. The more nervous he would get, I would realize I couldn't be. I don't have that luxury. And so I had to make sure that I was in charge the whole time. ATC definitely helped a lot. Having somebody there, again, as an instructor, I tell them all the time, be on flight following, have somebody on the radio. don't be intimidated by them. They're there to help. And that's exactly what happened. I felt like I wasn't alone. Even though we were together in the airplane, you still can feel slightly alone. And so having him there talking me through everything was a lot of support. I think that helped as well.
Tell us about the importance of checklists during the emergency as well.
We push checklist as instructors. So it's natural, especially if you've flown any type of jet crew type environment. SICs, that's your number one job, right? So captains always fly, and the SIC pulls the checklist and tells the captain, and he confirms everything that's been done. And so it was very quick for me. Declare, full checklist, line by line, even though you know some of the things don't even pertain to what you're doing. Line by line, go through it, make sure everything is done properly. Even though we couldn't get the engine started to shut it down, you want to make sure you turn off all the fuel. There's things that happen that is so easy to overlook because you become hyper focused on what you're doing. So you'll channel into just keeping your airspeed and where you're going. And then they'll forget to put their gear down. So making sure that you have something that you're reading line by line definitely helps.
Yes, I've noticed when practicing engine outs, when the client was an instructor and when they try to do it from memory, even instructors can't remember all of the steps under the best of circumstances. So I agree. Yeah. It's checklist. You got to do it because even under the best of circumstances, nobody can remember every step.
Exactly. They'll always forget one, and that's when it's planned. They know it's coming. I did not know it was coming.
Well, I'm sure you've had a lot of time to reflect back on this. Is there anything you think you might have done differently as you look back?
Well, yes. I think every time I've had other little incidents. I've never had an actual engine out. I've had another one where I lost 2 cylinders on a Cirrus, and it always comes first with a feeling, and then I'm double, triple checking myself. So I think that in hindsight, I need to start realizing that if I have a gut feeling and then I'm really trying to make sure an engine is good before I'm going, there's something going on. Maybe don't take the trip.
Okay. So you're saying you had a couple signs there before departure where maybe it would have made sense just to not take off?
Yes. I mean, and we know that. The more you've flown, the more you know there's always signs that lead up to what happens. Nothing just goes bang, explodes all of a sudden. There's something that is happening that I don't know if the universe is trying to tell you, the airplane's trying to tell you, or someone's trying to protect you. So maybe listen.
Right. Now, just to kind of wrap things up here, do you have any advice that you would give people who are listening to about dealing with emergencies and training that they might want to get for emergencies?
Follow your checklist and follow what you were taught. So I think especially as instructors, we need to make sure that we're enforcing that over and over again, because it's easy when you're in a corporate environment. It's a natural thing to do. Private pilots that fly the same 172 over and over again, they tend to become a little bit more lackadaisical. Especially as a CSIP, we encourage our clients to come back every 90 days to fly with us. Unfortunately, a lot of other pilots, they don't fly with an instructor, but once every 2 years. So it's a long time to go in between training. And these are the things that really matter and create the same habits early and try and do them over and over again. So maybe make sure you train often with an instructor. It's not to find your fault. It's to help you and get you prepared for the moments where you don't know things are coming.
Wow. Great summary. Anise, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed it. I hope people can learn from it. And I like the fact that I got to learn that I sounded really calm.
Well, and I hope that if I'm in a similar emergency, I can stay calm, because I've always thought, how will I do that? But I think what you said is you went back into pilot mode, you stayed focused, and that's what helped you stay calm.
Yeah, you have to. Otherwise, the other option of giving up and letting the airplane take over isn't going to help you at all.
Got to stay in charge. Thanks so much, Anise.
Thank you.
And before Anise landed in the field, the Fort Worth Center controllers gave her a phone number to call. She gave them a call about a minute after she touched down on the ground, and here's what that conversation sounded like.
Fort Worth Center, Oak City Falls, hello?
We're safe on the ground.
Oh, thank God. Okay, well, we got people coming to you, so you should have some sort of police or something out there.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Center, feed off 430, take a level 360.
Okay, thank you so much for your help.
Oh, no, you did awesome. Good job.
Thank you.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
My thanks to Anise Shapiro for sharing her story. And if you have a story of an emergency that you've been involved with and you'd like to share it with listeners, please send me an email at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com, and we'll talk about getting you here on the show to share your story. And finally, please, if you would help us out by just telling all of your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. If they don't know what a podcast is, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and then have them download our dedicated app, and it's free. Just search in the App Store for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.